sempre, talvez, eu trabalho com educação. Assim, já no INSPER, o meu estágio foi num instituto que trabalha com educação e segurança pública.
Eu não sabia onde os estudos iam me levar, mas eu sabia que iam me levar longe.
Trabalhei na Fundação Lehman 6 anos, dirigindo, liderando a área de pesquisas, e há 2 anos eu fundei o IED, que é um slogan, Interdisciplinaridade de Evidências no Debate Educacional, que busca levar pesquisas e dados para os tomadores de decisão em educação.
Depois de formada, o meu sonho era entrar no programa de trainee do Itaú, e no segundo ano em que eu estava prestando o processo, eu fui aprovada no trainee especialista do Itaú BBA.
Eu estou terminando o doutorado em educação. Minha visão é virar professor e contribuir para mudar a academia no Brasil.
Eu estou na fase final do programa de trainee. Agora o meu sonho é ser alocada em uma área que eu goste, fazer uma carreira de sucesso dentro do banco. E meu sonho também é poder adotar alguém como mentora, como madrinha para o programa de bolsas e poder devolver ao INSPER tudo que eu recebi.
Para a gente ter o Brasil que a gente quer, a gente precisa investir na educação. Então hoje não me vejo, acho que é impossível sair dessa área e acho que, na verdade, eu quero trazer mais pessoas para a área porque a gente precisa muito.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm showing us frozen on my screen, but I'll just go ahead and believe that I'm not frozen to you guys. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Diego Werneck Arguelles. I'm a professor of law here at INSPER, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Professor Bruce Ackerman, and our discussants, Professors Ana Robalinho and Tomás Pereira. So this was thought of a webinar to seize the opportunity of Professor Ackerman's recent book, Revolutionary Constituições, Charismatic Leadership and the Rule of Law, published in 2009. And since it has just been translated to Portuguese, we thought of inviting Professor Ackerman to discuss some of his ideas on the book and beyond here with us. So Ackerman opens the book by stating that constitutionalism is not a one-size-fits-all ideal, which is also an apt takeaway of his long-standing engagement, both with comparative and US constitutional law, politics, and history. And in both strands of his work on constitutions, he has made landmark contributions in the last decades to many of our ideas on how constitutions change and what is their relationship to manifestations of popular sovereignty, which appears in his work not as an item from a distant past, but as something we might see unfolding in our own lifetimes. And he has shown how such questions are answered in different countries, not just with constitutional theory, but also out of the concrete political struggles and historical experiences of different generations. I could not here do justice to the full range of his contributions to the field in this brief intro, and while I could also not do justice to what he means to many generations of scholars, today the three of us are here to at least try to do so in the only way we can. Professor Ackerman believes in and works with ideas, and as three former students of Bruce here, we are here today to critically consider and discuss his arguments. To do so, I'm delighted to share this webinar with my colleagues Tomás from UniFV Rio and Ana Robalinho, who is a doctoral student at Yale, whom I thank for accepting this invitation. So without further delay, Professor Ackerman will begin his presentation. He will be followed by Ana and then Tomás and myself, if time allows it. Then we will give Bruce a chance to react to our comments, and then we proceed to Q&A. I will be collecting some questions from the YouTube comment section within our time constraints. So thank you once again, Professor Ackerman. We are honored to have you here, and please, I'll give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me begin with the present. As Diego suggests, each generation has to struggle to define its own principles of legitimacy. And so first, let's confront the tragedy, and I use this in the Greek sense of the word tragedy, of the last 4 years of Brazilian history. I actually can understand and speak Portuguese, except in Lisbon, which is in which Portuguese is entirely unintelligible to me. But in Brazil, this is not a problem. And so I have had experience with Brazil from the 1980s to the present, actually, frequently visiting your country and speaking to interested and scholars and politicians occasionally too. And if I had asked someone in 2014, how are you doing in Brazil? They would answer with pride. We first had this Collor. We got rid of him. Then we moved to 2 terms of responsible centrism, in which thoughtful politicians were struggling about classical issues in a way that, after all, that's what democratic politics is all about. Then we have a shift to the left center with someone who, by virtue of his personality, I mean, here is someone who not only spoke for the lower classes, but himself was, for the first time in Brazilian history, an impoverished person who, through his own struggles, actually ascended to leadership. And even though he lost earlier, he kept on moving, and he also shifted his views, I should emphasize, so that he is a left center position, and wins twice with an innovative conception, the Bolsa Familiar. Familiar or familiar? I always, you have to excuse my Portuguese. Which has been an example in many different countries throughout the world. And then what happens? Dilma, a first-rate intelligence, a person who has been tested, whose leadership skills, mind you, I am not talking politically here, that I'm in favor of this or not. I'm just talking about one, and she wins, and then she wins again. This is political autonomy. The Brazilian system is working, right? One should appreciate this. And then we have these 4 years. And I want to distinguish between the first element in the 4 years, which is the impeachment of Dilma, and the next developments. In the impeachment of Dilma, there is absolutely no foundation for this. I mean, I'm talking as a lawyer. If in France, this would never have happened, because there has to be an independent decision that there is significant evidence of serious malpractice in office. you have the tools. You already have an electoral commission, electoral Supreme Court. And if Bolsonaro loses, it is of the greatest importance not to have another impeachment like this one, a politicized impeachment. Rather, we should make it a fundamental distinction, which happily the Brazilian constitution already has, between short-term crises that should be governed by the electoral court and long-term principles which should be determined by the constitutional court. A necessary condition, as in France, for an impeachment, the Constitution should be amended so as to say the electoral court, which has 7 members, who selected in a distinctive fashion. Maybe it should be changed. You could. That's up to you to decide. Should, within a very brief period, 60 days, 90 days, determine whether there is substantial evidence, holding hearings, and then only if it, by a majority, a supermajority, decides yes, can impeachment proceed. At the end of the 4-year term, if a person then leaves office, of course, he or she could then be subjected to standard civil and criminal penalties for malfeasance before or during office. But the idea that a successfully re-elected president can simply be discharged, this is unacceptable. Now, we then move to the other questions, which, it seems to me reasonable people can agree or disagree on the question of what Moro did, what the Supreme Court did. These are issues which are, questions of fair dispute, and the new constitution might, I think, would be well advised to make the criteria clearer, so that in a crisis like this one happening 25 years from now, and that's what we're talking about here, 25 years from now, the similar judges could have clearer guidelines and not take so much of the responsibility, political responsibility, on themselves. But that's what the Constitution, there were a lot of different issues to be resolved in 1987, 88, 89, and this was one of many. So the first issue is, as I say, try to vindicate the idea that this tragedy will not happen again in the future. Maybe some other tragedy will, but not this one. That the Brazilian people can vindicate its relative success until the day before yesterday. The second key principle for a constitution. Now, I say, if Trump wins and Bolsonaro wins, we're moving into a dark age. Period. This will be a tragedy of incredible dimension. Not only for the New World, but for the world. Brazil and the United States are in a relatively favorable position compared to Europe, compared to India, compared to China, to sustain the tradition of Enlightenment democracy. However depressing the situation is here, it's much more depressing there. Now, the second great point is the state of emergency. As you all know, and as I am painfully aware, Bolsonaro is already preparing for a state of emergency and calling on the military to redeem its historical function from 1891 through many periods afterwards as the guardian of the Constitution. State of emergency plus military takeover is a formula for dictatorship. Bolsonaro is simply exemplifying this. This has happened many, many times in many different places around the world. This should not be permitted. A proposal I've made, which is actually one of the proposals that have gained quite a good deal of public attention and positive response in France and other places, is a super majoritarian escalator, because of course emergencies do exist, and once again you have the Electoral Commission, which is there to enforce it, these principles and rules. The proposal I made, as I said, goes like this. If the president declares a state of emergency, this is valid for 60 days, but cannot be continued unless a majority of the Congress, the lower house, approves it. If it isn't approved at the end of 60 days, the Electoral Commission says, no, stop. There is no emergency. But the emergency can be continued for another 60 days with a 60% majority in Congress, and then with a 70% majority in Congress, and then with an 80% majority in Congress, and then for another 2 months and another 2 months, so long as the president can get 80% support in Congress. That means that the president's opponents in the opposing parties in Congress have to support the president. It is not in their political interest to support the president unless there really is an emergency. You see. So we have a political check and balance on what Bolsonaro is proposing. And next time, you see, 25 years from now, once again, it might not be Bolsonaro. It might be an extreme leftist. We don't know. Or an extreme person from some other angle. We are writing a constitution for the future and trying to reflect on our own experiences of self-government in the present, with a background in the past that I will now glimpse at for 5 minutes, if you will allow me, or not. Thomas, what would you think?
Of course, please.
Of course? Okay. I mean, it's the of course, in the 1960s, you see, while Brazil, until throughout the 19th and early 20th century, we have Brazil being relatively autonomous because the Americans, the United States, that is, lacks the military capacity to control Brazil. Then we have this remarkable period in which Vargas and Roosevelt are together, as well as in Mexico, in the affirmation of a third way between communism and capitalism. Roosevelt, this is corporativism. Capitalists cannot fire workers. They have to bargain with labor unions. They must, the labor must be represented on the boards of the corporation in lots of different ways. This is the principle of Roosevelt's New Deal and Vargas's system. And to express this unity, when Franklin Roosevelt wins his decisive victory in 1936 for the New Deal, how does he celebrate it? Franklin Roosevelt is a profoundly disabled individual. He goes and has never traveled outside of the United States, because if he goes outside the United States and has a heart attack or something, what about the doctors and things of this kind? As immediately after his victory on November 3rd, the first thing he does is go on a battleship and come to Rio de Janeiro and celebrate with Vargas the triumph of the New Deal and the Novo Ordo. Then so rather than thinking of the United States simply as a intervening in 1964, 62, 63, 64, through the CIA, one should appreciate that in the deep background, there is the first period, a period of Brazil is being celebrated by the Americans. So what's to account for the difference? Answer: the Cuban Missile Crisis, a completely irrelevant event so far as Brazil is concerned, with devastating consequences, however. John F. Kennedy confronts the Khrushchev, who is sending missiles to Cuba so as to threaten the United States within 75 miles of the United States. And Kennedy responds and actually threatens Russia with nuclear attack, and Khrushchev backs down. This leads the Americans, specialists in Latin America, to take this dramatic shift. Before, they're perfectly happy dealing with the Brazilians, etc., even though now it's the communists. And there are communists in Brazil, and there are. Of course, there are communists in the United States, too. We cannot allow this to happen. If Brazil turns and pro-Castro, then the New World is against us. We can't let this happen. And so we intervene. America intervenes with the CIA and destroys the successful politics of post-Vargas. In 1945, they count the votes. Vargas loses, he then wins, etc., and so forth. And then finally, we have a leftist who comes in 1960. Aha, he is really dangerous. We overthrow him. It's the Americans that do it, not the Brazilians. And for the first time in history, America has the military and economic capacity to intervene on the cheap. You see, the CIA is cheap. The Americans are much more interested in what's going on in China, Japan, Europe, Russia. So they put in the generals who, of course, have this tradition from 1891 as being the guardians of the Constitution. And it's only in 1980s, you have to remember, 1987 is, the Brazilians are part of a world revolution. And suddenly the Americans are saying, we won the Cold War. Let's have freedom and democracy. The Americans are supportive in 1987 of the shift. They put pressure on the military in 1985 to buckle down and accept direita. They are no longer the cold warriors of 1964. And today, the Americans are anti-Bolsonaro. I mean, except for the, as I said, the Americans, the tradition of the Enlightenment Republic coming out of the French and American revolutions, and then the Bolivarian Revolution, et cetera, and so forth. This tradition, I'm not the only person in this tradition. If we beat Trump in 2024, and you beat Bolsonaro, we have an opportunity, both together with Mexico once again, to make the new world a really exemplar place for Enlightenment democracy, but which doesn't mean that we all have to agree on a consensus. Of course, we're going to disagree. That's what voting is about. Democracy is about, I win 55% of the vote, you win 45% of the vote, you lose, I win. There's a lot of reasonable disagreement within this structure of revitalized commitment to the fundamental principles of no states of emergency that go on and that are used as a cover for military takeovers, and no politicization of impeachment. By some weird paradox, it's Kohler who is guiding the future of Brazil at the present time, and that is ridiculous. And you can do something about it. In conclusion, I want to emphasize one final point. Until very, very recently, to give you an example, in the United States, which was at the forefront of higher education in the 20th century, it no longer is, but it's still high up, but no longer is at the forefront. During the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s, the percentage of Americans who had graduated, who were white and graduated a university with a bachelor's degree, 8%. Black, 4% of Blacks graduated with a bachelor's degree. Today, in the United States, 40% a percent of Americans have graduated with a university degree. 28% Blacks, more women than men, have graduated with a university degree. And even more remarkably, 10% of Americans have more than a university degree, a bachelor's degree. They have a master's in business administration or in medicine or in philosophy or political science or whatever. In other words, 10% of Americans, Black and white, have more than a university degree. While in the 1960s, less than 10% had graduated college, and only 50% had graduated high school. 50%. Now, Brazil is not at this level yet. 27% of Brazilians between the ages of 21 and 26, it might be 24, I think, something like that, are still in college or going to university. 27%. And Dilma, in particular, did great work in increasing the education level for people in, making real steps to increase literacy and real education in the rural areas of Brazil, especially, amongst the poor in general. The 27%, 50 years ago, what was the percentage of Brazilians with a university degree? Almost nobody. 27% doesn't compare favorably to the United States or to Europe, but you're moving in the right direction. The Brazilian population is capable of actually thinking and talking about the issues in a way that didn't happen. Wasn't possible in America, in the United States, during the height of the Civil Rights Revolution. So while we have big problems, Brazilians and Mexicans and Americans are the most educated in the history of the world, and could finally actually redeem the fundamental promise of the French Revolution, which was that people would actually engage in self-government rather than have the super rich do it for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ackerman. So we will proceed to Ana Robalinho's comments. Ana, obrigado.
Thank you, Diego. Tomás, nice to see you, Professor. As always, listening to you talk gives me new insights into what we've actually been living through, especially in this last few years. And I have many questions, but I will save some of them for future conversations. And I will focus on something you said early in your talk today, and I thought was quite intriguing, which was your suggestion about changing the way we think about impeachment. I think impeachment was a huge part of Brazilian political development in the last 3 decades, and we've had to deal with it over and over again in ways that changed, I think, the future of our politics. And the reason I was particularly intrigued by your suggestion is that it seems to me like you were suggesting a change that would turn impeachment into a more technical issue and a less political issue. I mean, definitely a move away from the traditional American model, which we pretty much copied since the 1891 Constitution. And that is interesting, not only because it's moving away from the system that we actually copied when we adopted presidentialism, but it's also interesting because I think it's a move away from the general feeling and the conversation about impeachment, especially during our second experience with impeachment of President Dilma. During that time and in the years following the impeachment of President Dilma, there was a lot of conversation about impeachment becoming within the Brazilian political experience almost like a vote of no confidence. It seemed like people were suggesting that it was okay to impeach a president as long as they have lost general confidence within the political class. And that's actually, in a way, it was a conversation about empowering Congress and making impeachment more of a political issue, making it a completely political issue. And in an interesting way, that's also was perceived as a move towards a system that looked less like a traditional presidential system and more like a parliamentarian system. And it seems to me like your proposal is moving in a different direction. It's actually moving towards making impeachment less political, making Congress less empowered in the process of impeachment by involving a different institution, perhaps the electoral court, as you suggested, in this process. It would definitely have yielded different results if we had a system such as that in place back in 2016. And I wonder, and I'll end my comment here with a question for you, which I hope you'll have time to answer. Is that a move towards a better presidential system? Because I thought that it was a very non-Ackermanian move that you made with your comment. So thank you very much.
Okay, so perhaps we can follow to Tomás and gather a few questions before giving Professor Ackerman a chance to react. Thank you, Ana.
Oh, of course. I thought he was going to answer before, but anyway, great. Excellent to be here. Thank you, Ana, Diego. It's always been great to be with you. It's great to be with you, Professor Ackerman. I feel like I'm back at one of our seminars, which brings me great joy. So I think I'm going to follow Ana, specifically talking about impeachment. I feel like it's something which we can talk about. So I agree with Ana Robalinho that was one of the things that we were talking about, that, what might happen after Dilma Rousseff was, the banalization of impeachment in a way. Actually, I'm not one of the people who actually agreed with that. It seems to me that what impeachment Dilma Rousseff showed us is that it's hard to impeach a president, even in a situation that you could call as a perfect storm. Economic crisis plus major corruption scandal affecting the party in power. Which brings me to my question. I feel like very few systems and very few presidents and very few prime ministers, even less prime ministers, could ever survive a crisis like the 2015 crisis. And although it was a tragic, that it happened and it had tragic consequences, if you're talking in abstract, it's a good thing in a way. It can be a good thing that is, that maybe no one can survive a crisis like that. And if you have a major economic crisis and a major corruption scandal, that is kind of normal that you're going to see some kind of movement. So it might be a vote of no confidence if you're in a parliamentary system. It might be, snap election. We might see or you might see an impeachment, right? So, and I'm just talking about, what might happen descriptively. Now, and this goes to my point. I feel like part of your comment on the design issue seems to be the kind of effort that, in, again, a broader sense, I tend to be skeptical about. It seems to me that when we see that an error has been committed, that, a decision that we disagree has been committed by an institution, we tend to think about how can we, redesign the system to guarantee that that's never going to happen again. Obviously, depending on the mistake that could have happened, if you see the problem as being a fundamental institutional consequence of fundamental institutional design. But I also think that no institutional design is ever going to be perfect. Every institution is going to give decisions with which it disagree. That goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court gives, decisions on the constitutionality of norms every week, with which, a big part of the lawyer establishment of constitutional scholars disagree about, and they might actually think that are completely wrong. At least once a month. Let's not say every week, but at least once a month. That happens here. It happens in Germany. It happens in the United States. It happens often enough, right? So why would the impeachment process be different? How could we ever think that you're going to have an impeachment process in which there's never the impeachment of someone that shouldn't have been impeached, or the opposite? Someone is not impeached, which might actually be what you're seeing right now, right, with Bolsonaro, right? Someone who should have been impeached, considering what he has done, and impeachment process has not moved forward. And that goes to, so I basically, in a sense, I'm adding my comments to highlighting Ana Beatriz questions, which has to do with, in the end, it becomes a decision about, are you going to make it more political or less political? And it seems to me that, in a way, what we have in Brazil is a process that is political and enough. Let's just say, you have both houses. There's a level of support that you need to initiate the process. There's a level of support that you need to actually take it further. It has to do with multiple supports and multiple organization in the party process. So I definitely have minute and specific problems with and we have talked about it. We have even collaborated. Diego and I have collaborated in proposals for reform of the process, not in a specific way that the procedure happens in the House and in the Senate. But I'm actually particularly skeptical about giving it, for example, to an electoral commission the power to do so. Not only because I'm not sure that it will be actually more independent, but also because I tend to believe that would actually lead to more judicialization of the process also. That if you have seen less judicialization of the impeachment process in Brazil, in a good sense, has been because there is a general separation of power respect for the fact that this is understood to be a power of Congress. And I can see how, if you just start adding institutions or giving a preview to, electoral commission, something like that, then I can totally see the judiciary in the Supreme Court, saying, well, now it's a legal issue, so now it's up to us. And that might actually be even more problematic in generating a larger crisis if now the Supreme Court, these 11 judges, or 6 among these 11 judges, are actually the ones who are going to decide if impeachment is if a president is going to stay or not.
Thank you, Tomas. Professor Ackerman, if I may add a few remarks before your reactions. So I guess impeachment is the topic for this initial round, and I'm going to add a few ideas, although I feel that, as we say in Portuguese, I might be pouring rain on wet ground. Chover no molhado. I might be redundant considering what's already been said, but I'll try to phrase it somewhat differently. So you mentioned, Professor Ackerman, that democracy is all about a mechanism for solving disagreement, right? This is what democracy is all about. You vote, somebody will lose, and will disagree with the outcome of the decision, but that's what the procedure does. And I think one thing that we learned in Brazil after these 2 impeachments, very different impeachments, but they have a similar lesson, I think, beyond what Tomas and Ana have already discussed, because I think this is connected to Tomas's point, that impeachment it's not necessarily described as a mechanism to remove from office people who committed malfeasances, serious conducts against the Constitution. Impeachment can also be thought of as a procedure to solve disagreements on which presidents have committed serious malfeasances, right? So one thing that it's important to notice on the Brazilian experience is that, legally speaking, the Collor impeachment, perhaps it was less uncontroversial. It's not controversial today, but back then, arguments were also made in the sense that there were problems with the procedure, that there was no direct evidence. I don't think those particularly strong arguments. My point is not that that was legally an incorrect decision. My point is rather that if Collor had the political support to turn these legal controversies in something relevant, perhaps we would be looking at that impeachment in a very different way. So what I'm saying is, if you think that these are, and I think this, I'm agreeing with Thomas here, these are issues that will necessarily be divisive, and that people will disagree on what counts as a serious offense or not, serious enough to merit removal from office. And impeachment is the procedure we have to deal with such disagreements. And one problem with this procedure, as we learn in Brazil, is that we haven't been able, differently from what so far was the case with the votes, we haven't been able to to have a decision that was politically controversial at least be accepted as legitimate. So this didn't happen in Brazil, and the wounds from 2016 are still open, and I don't think that decision was able to pacify the conflict that surrounded it. And I think the problem is not necessarily in the specifics of the legal arguments at stake, although I will concede that there are differences, of course, between Dilma's case and Collor's case. But there's something to be pointed out on, how people will, in a politically controversial impeachment, they will necessarily react in a different way than they would react to a less politically controversial impeachment, regardless of the legal merits. That's my point. And the legal merits are all about disagreement, and we need a procedure to solve them. So just like to add that. And so the question, and then I would ask for your thoughts also on a brief comparison with the US case, because there's this minor, perhaps, difference in the impeachment procedure in the US and in Brazil, in the sense that, not minor, my argument is that it's not as minor as it seems, but in the US, you say that a president is impeached after the House has approved the charges, right? So that means something already. So if a president is indicted by the House in this way, he's impeached, she's impeached. But in Brazil, the House authorizes the trial before the Senate, and then the Senate decides. So presidents who are able to survive the trial are not impeached. But why is this perhaps important? Because one of the things that I thought it was interesting, and you wrote op-eds in this sense, was that one of the arguments for prosecuting Trump, for pushing the impeachment of Trump in the House, even though it was mostly likely that he would not be convicted at the Senate, was that it was important to draw a line, to say, no, he was impeached. There is a sufficient critical mass to say that what he did was a violation of the Constitution, and we should be able to draw this line. So perhaps then I would like to does this make sense? Does this make sense to say that attaching stronger weight to this phase one at least fulfills the purpose of saying maybe we are too divided to convict, but we're not divided enough to draw a line saying, no, this is serious enough. And it never happened in Brazil to have phase one without phase two reaching an end. Most likely because politicians calculate in the following way. If phase two, if you know that the outcome is not going to be a conviction, why would we bother to support authorization in the first place in the House? But just lots of perhaps unconnected comments, but I think they all go, perhaps the heart of my comments is this idea that there's something there's a deep connection between disagreement, political disagreement, and impeachment beyond its legal merits. And perhaps I think this small difference in the US case, am I seeing too much in this difference? Perhaps it is an interesting feature to consider, and I'll leave it there.
Right. May I respond, or? Yeah. Well, my fundamental point, and it is ironic, all of you people are focusing on the wrong country, the United States. look, your system is French. From beginning to end, it's French. The French have impeachment. Macron, it is Macron, if he had been elected in Brazil, would be impeached. Right? He doesn't have a majority in Congress, in the Chamber of Deputies, and he has even less of one in the Senate. If he were impeached right now, this would be a disaster for Europe. He can't be impeached because he hasn't done anything that is of the form that merits impeachment. This was a self-conscious and elaborate conversation at the Constitutional Convention of 2008, I think. Don't get me on the number. In which actually I was a participant, but as an advisor, et cetera, and so forth. Let's take another example of in which you are copying the French to your great advantage over the United States, just to give it a sense of perspective. You, like the French, have a double system, right? One at time one, you lots of different political parties put up candidates, and the top two then run off, unless one of them gets 51%, right? This means that this is a much better system than the American primary system. In the American primary system, there's a Republican primary and a Democratic primary. What that means is that the candidates, Trump would never have been nominated if we had had the French or Brazilian system. Because all the Democrats would have voted against Trump. And a lot of Republicans would have voted against Trump and for Romney or someone like that. But we have a system that we've inherited from 1843. Now, this goes back to another fundamental issue. The United States Constitution is the oldest in the world that is functioning. At the time of it was put into force, there was only one chamber of the government was directly elected by the voters, and there was a property requirement on the voters. So the number of voters at the first Congress was, let's say, about they were only male voters, maybe 500,000 voters. The Senate was not directly elected until 1917, and the president was not directly elected at all, right? He was indirectly elected through the Electoral College, which has led to the crisis of 2020. So we had a system of impeachment, which we inherited from the British, in which the directly elected body, the House of Representatives, impeached. And then the Senate, which is indirectly selected from the legislatures at that time, then considered whether despite the passions of the House of Representatives, we should go along. This system is ridiculous today, but we haven't changed it. Indeed, we are now in the process of trying to reform it, and I've played some small role in this. President Biden is about to sign amendments to the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which is the last time the problem of presidential selection was at all seriously considered. 1887. You don't have a 200-year-old Constitution. And you've been copying the Americans selectively, even though, in fact, you are copying the French. Indeed, one of the very interesting and fascinating parts of comparative constitutional law is during the last 30 or 40 or 50 years of American hegemony since the Berlin Wall to now, until Trump, before Trump, here is the United States, which is the world hegemon of an unexampled kind. Never in the history of humanity has been a country culturally, economically, politically, militarily as dominant. And yet, when the Eastern Europeans copied the presidential system, which a number of them did do, they copied the French system, not the American system. Fascinating. So my first and fundamental point is, as Anna suggested, in 1987, they copied the American impeachment. It isn't as if this was a very deliberate decision. This was just like thrown in. The crucial set of decisions was generated by the fact that the transitional president died, and we have someone in office who has only one concern: I want to stay in office for 5 years. That's what I want to do. And I'm going to use the Constitutional Court, which is entirely illegitimate, selected entirely by the military, as a battering ram and a weapon against the parliamentary design of the original Constitutional Convention of 1987. And then we have, as a result of this struggle, that we have the election of the first real election, which is one in which Lula isn't the candidate. Why? Well, that's a fascinating question, which we can get into maybe later on. But the election of 1989 is very similar to the Democratic election of 2016. We have two candidates of the left, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. You had two candidates of the left in 1989, and as a consequence, someone who 2 or 3 months beforehand had 8% of the vote, Kohler, manages to squeak through and beat a weak candidate and a weak opponent. Then, as a result of corruption, et cetera, and so forth, he gets successfully eliminated. The reason why I'm talking about these micro details is that you are, of course, absolutely right in saying, we got rid of Kolar, and it was really hard to get rid of Dilma. Et cetera, and so forth. What I want to say is that the crucial feature, and this helps organize us back into the other question of the state of emergency, we have to make a distinction between things that are at the center of attention for almost all people in Brazil. These are called crises. This is not a question of elite legal discourse or elite political discourse. Everybody knows that they're going after Dilma. Or everybody knows that that Bolsonaro is planning a military coup if he loses. Everybody knows that. Then there are a million issues that, one or another small part of the population, sometimes it's only political, legal elite, sometimes it's activists, they're aware of these issues. Now, what I want to say is, and what marvelously the Brazilian Constitution says, is we should make a fundamental distinction between these crises in which everyone knows that the future of, that something really is shaking in the foundations of the system. Cheating on the vote count, throwing out a president. These things are at everybody's attention. Another one that's right now on everybody's attention, not so, I don't know, it's interesting to what extent it is in the United States. It's the Ukraine. Who would have thought? And what we see is Biden using his powers of the state of emergency to get around Congress, just in the way that Trump did. He is reinforcing the state of emergency by precedence. Now, what I'm saying in your case is you have been this mode of impeachment that you have was copied from the Americans. Why was it copied from the Americans? Because the Americans had a great success on impeachment. Richard Nixon, who, in an unappreciated act of great statesmanship, resigned. He didn't have to resign. If he hadn't resigned, would he have been convicted? I don't know. Nor does anyone else. But he was a great statesman. Dilma could have said, I'm not going to resign. This is a political persecution. She is Nixon. You're not giving enough credit because, you have this revolutionary tradition, as I've been describing it. When we go back to Vargas, how did Vargas get in? Through assaulting the Constitution, and he succeeded. Dilma or Lula, they could have, when Lula is thrown into jail 39 days before the election, he could have said, everyone boycott or not, right? he didn't say anything. If he had said boycott, of course, Bolsonaro would have won with a very weak turnout. Instead, by being a statesman, he had a weak successor lose. So the basic point is that you're absolutely right, all three of you, that there is no magic solution to problems. But one should distinguish between crises that the general population recognize go to the foundations of the system, as in Dilma's discharge, which then puts a tremendous responsibility on a single person. Should I, as happened between 1891 and 1896, begin a counter-revolution? Or shall I accept the judgment, even though the mass of the population is saying, what are these people in Brasilia doing? That this kind of, they're not representing anything about us. They're engaging in, power politics, as opposed to what the Supreme Court should be about, which is not crisis, but principle and thoughtful adjudication of principles, as one of you, I forget which one, I think it was Thomas, who was saying, every month we have a debate about whether the decision is correctly decided or not. Who is the we? Who is the we? Thoughtful people, now well-educated, maybe even as many as 10% of the population. To give you one other a sense of the a situation, I don't have the numbers in the United States, but in Brazil, but I can give you the numbers in the United States. The percentage of total time on the internet that is spent on news, whether it be extreme right, extreme left, New York Times Center, 8% of all time on the internet is spent on news. Right? That's quite a lot. Compared to, however, 17% of time on the internet that is spent on pornography. 11% on the internet that is spent on sports. So we have this population that is spending some time on news and public affairs. It isn't that they're ignorant as they were in Brazil 50 or 75 years ago. They're spending some time, but it's only when something like Dilma, suddenly it would be interesting, probably you could find out. I mean, this is what is the percentage of time that was devoted to, by ordinary users of the internet and cell phones and things like that, to news during the impeachment of Dilma compared to ordinary? My guess is it will be tremendously increased. This is what happened with Trump's impeachments. Tremendous increase in attention. Well, I don't want to go to the legal mistakes made in the Trump impeachment. But the crucial thing, and I'd like to now go back to the state of emergency, which is another question. Are you saying that that the state of emergency shouldn't be policed by the electoral election authority court because it's too political? If you're saying that, what is the role of the election authority, however organized? Is it simply to make sure that there's a formally free count of the election, and then to scream and yell when Bolsonaro or the future Bolsonaro cheats? I think that a crucial theme in both of these and in many others is preemptive control. Make it hard to do something which can be abused with catastrophic consequences, even though you're right that some of the time it will be too hard. But the dangers of states of emergency and impeachment in the American mode rather than in the French mode are, it seems to me, too great given the danger, given the cost. So it is, as always in designing a constitution, thoughtful comparisons, but my basic thesis is that you're making the wrong comparisons between U.S. and Brazil, rather than between Brazil and the French system, which in major respects you are copying from the Conseil Constitutionnel. You know, we can elaborate similarities and differences, but it's that comparison which is crucial, it seems to me, in the analysis of your presidential system. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ackerman. Would Tomas, since there was a reference to your question, the end of Professor Ackerman's remarks, would you like to comment, or I can add something?
No, when I was talking about the electoral commission, I was just I was actually talking more specifically about in the impeachment process, but and bear in mind that the election commission has the power to notify the election for malfeasance in the electoral, and it could have with Dilma and Tema. The electoral court actually judged after the impeachment.
Yes,
it was going to notify the election, and it could have, in that way, had actually removed Temer and decided not to do. Many would argue for political reasons in some way. And then I don't want to get into very specific issues of design, but in the specific case of the electoral court in Brazil, which is extremely independent for a number of issues, for conducting the election and for judging, no major crisis kind of cases. But I think it's important to bear in mind that it is basically made up of 3 Supreme Court justices out of 11 that rotate. So it's a minority. So it might be 3 that don't even would make 6 in the court. They might actually not have the support of the rest of the court. They're there in a rotation basis. You have 2 judges that come from the Superior Court, who often want to be nominated to the Supreme Court at some point in their careers, which is a problem because they are there judging the president, and some of them might want to go to the Supreme Court, and they're there judging senators, and they might want to go to the Supreme Court. And lawyers, usually nominated, who are extremely active in the court. The electoral lawyers that are nominated as judges of the court are the electoral lawyers that defend all the politicians in all the process, and that's how they become nominatables, notables, electoral.
Right.
So I would I have serious problems with that specific design, but then I don't want to get into specific issues of how to design the electoral commission in a way that it would be more independent.
I do want to get into it because the French have figured it out. They have the Conseil Constitutionnel. Now, what is the Conseil Constitutionnel? They people who are old, senior, and either previous constitutional court judges or people like that, who have no future and they are forbidden from running for anything. So you're absolutely right. This existing design is inadequate to the problem, just as the rules are inadequate. We could, I'm not, for reasons that Anna pointed out earlier, this was just put in there as one of many things and not the most important thing. But experience over the last 30 years suggests that, but I'm completely agreeing with you that this is sort of like one of the most interesting features of the Chilean Constitutional Convention right now, is that no member of the government can serve in the convention. And why? Because if they could, they would then use the Constitution simply to enhance the powers of the president. So you're absolutely right that the design of this institution is of great significance, and we would have to look at how the Germans do it, how the French do it, how the Spanish do it, etc., and so forth, because this has been, as a result of crises similar, Italians, a centerpiece of many systems. It's only in the United States and in Chile, in Brazil, that it has risen to centrality recently. So to return amusingly to the theme of this comparative constitutionalism in the book that just was translated into Portuguese and all this, precisely, we have to broaden our scale of reference, and especially when we encounter problems that are new for us. Let's take a problem that is really terrifyingly new for Americans: the increasing role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. If there is a crisis in 2024 in which there are contested votes and all of this, they are going to meet, ironically enough, once again on January 6th. On January 20th, the term of the existing President Biden ends. And if there are several people claiming to be president, the crucial decision maker is going to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because he has to decide who to obey. Terrible. Terrible. In 1805, the standing army of the United States was 2,000 people. Well, things have changed a lot since then. And yet we are stuck with this constitutional framework that made sense 2 centuries ago. So in any event, but you're absolutely right that these issues that are new for us, we have to look as broadly as we can. How are they handling this problem in India? Because they have an analogous one. Not that we should copy anybody, but we should use this as a source of reflection if we get the opportunity to do so. Well, that's my thought anyway. Now, perhaps I can, this is up to you. We can do one of two things: have questions from the audience, or I can give you a 2-minute reflection on presidentialism versus parliamentarianism in Brazil, but it's up to you.
So, Professor Ackerman, I have just a quick comment on some of the things you said.
Yes, please.
And then perhaps this will segue into presidentialism, parliamentarism. I think so. And so, regarding impeachment, and So maybe this was not a deeply debated topic or remotely controversial in 87, 88, the Constitutional Convention in Brazil, but mostly because the rules we had were established focal points. They were copied from two constitutions before, three constitutions before. The existing statute regulating the specific crimes was enacted in the 50s. So I think there was a missed opportunity for deeper reflection on the system, but it was not a novelty in this sense.
Yes.
It had been there for
Yes.
so, and in a scenario where things are not polarized, not to the extent that would affect impeachment, it's easy to see how this becomes a focal point, right? But and now, in the same way, the Nixon scenario that you described, it was a different country as well. And in the very end of your book, you consider how the arguments that you make relate to the case of the US, even considering very recent developments. And I'll just take the idea that we live in a more polarized world than we lived in the 70s. So my question would be, so in the case of impeachment, I would imagine that if you have to decide these issues again today, I'm pretty sure the discussion would be very different. But it would be different also because the chances that we would have a Nixon, we surely could hope that our presidents should be like Dilma in the sense that they accept the result. And that's something commendable that I rightly agree. It's a very important decision to disagree with the outcome, but accept the necessity to leave office and accept it. But we are facing with presidents that might not even accept this possibility. So this is a very different world from the 80s or the 70s. So my just brief question would be, shouldn't we also consider that even the French solutions for some of these problems we are discussing, even those solutions might still need to be readjusted considering what we are seeing? To what extent this would be the case?
Yes, but the question is not readjusted, it's whether it should be made easier to impeach, or whether the system of the present should be criticized as too difficult or too easy. And that's the question, which is a fair question. As to the previous constitutions, these were from Vargas, in which was a very different era from the present. But as to the polarization, here's another fact from the United States. I don't know, but it's something worth finding out about Brazil. Throughout the 20th century, basically with variations, the political identities of people who were eligible to vote split 40% more or less Democrats, 40% more or less Republicans, and 20% independents. Since 2003 to the present, that's now 20 years, maybe really since 1990s, 30 years. In the United States, the largest group of people, and these are polls, Gallup polls, responsible polls, not, hack polls. 40% of the American electorate understands themselves as independents, in the sense that they reject understanding themselves as Republican or Democrat. Then there's about 30% Democrats and 30% Republicans. Half of them, in other words, 15% of the electorate, understand themselves as strong Republicans, Trumpists. 15% of the Democrats think of themselves as strong Democrats, as in, I'm for Bernie Sanders, or, right? So that means that polarization you have to have an analysis of two levels of polarization. One level is whether in Brasilia, the political parties try to destroy one another and don't cooperate, or not. In the United States, at the present time, the political leadership in the House and the Senate try to destroy the president, whoever he is, Democrat or Republican. That's true. But then there is this other level of the electorate. How does, and what about them? The great, well, let me put it in this way. The great contribution here is by Condorcet, as he is being trundled off to be executed in the French Revolution. He comes up with the idea of Condorcet's paradox. Even though everybody votes, there is not a single unique solution which is the majority winner. Right? This was then generalized in mathematical form by the brilliant Kenneth Arrow in Arrow's theorem. I strongly recommend that you read an English language rather than a mathematical version of Arrow's theorem, although I actually know enough math to do it. So what this teaches us is, for example, as I suggested before, that the primary system is of great significance, because what the primary system in America does means that the 15% of ideologues of the Republicans are the ones who actually participate intensely in the primaries, while the 15% of weak Republicans, people who could actually vote, participate much less. This is statistically true. And the same thing is true of the Democrats. And the 40% of the population are not even allowed to vote in the primary. At least in your system, the French system, they can. So this primary system element in the United States of Republican versus Democratic primaries vastly increases the chances of an extremist victory. So to put it in in the next election, we could have, let's suppose that both Trump and Biden are not the candidates. And they have a primary to replace him. So you'll have an extreme Trump person against, very likely, an extreme lefty. Let's say AOC, I don't know, who is a brilliant person, 40 years old, less than 40 years old, and from my point of view, has a lot. I would vote for her. But that's irrelevant. To have the American population with 40% who say, look, I want a middle of the road person, having to choose between an extreme Trump and an extreme lefty, that's going to alienate the voters from the system. Similarly, the aim of these crises is not to alienate the voters from the system. And that analytically leads to the question. So that's why I think that the crisis in management institution of a juridical technical kind is terribly important to preempt the problem rather than to let it occur and then at the end say, okay, well, they kicked out Dilma. And isn't that too bad? But it was, it was tough. They can't kick out, etc. So I guess I should conclude there with only one final word on parliamentarianism. You see, the fundamental difference between parliamentarianism and presidentialism is this. When you go into the election booth in a parliamentary system, you vote for a political position. You might say, I'm a center leftist. I'm going to vote for the center leftist party. If you, in a presidential system, you do not vote for a political position. You vote for a single leader. That is the crucial difference. And when you vote for a political position, there are pathologies that happen. So let's imagine there are 5 or 6 parties in the parliament, and they don't form a stable coalition. So instability is the pathology of parliamentarianism. And you have to design, or can design, to control this, but not to solve it. Charismatic revolutionaries is the pathology of presidentialism. Which pathology is worse? There are, in a fundamental constitutional conversation among scholars and jurists, I would strongly urge that to be a central issue for scholarship and debate in the context of Brazil. And I think that reasonable people can disagree about that, and therefore come up with different constitutional designs. And if you do have a constitutional convention or something like that, these designs will already be there, because when you have a constitutional convention, it lasts 6 months, it lasts a year. People are very busy. The things that have already been worked out, you're going to choose among them. These constitutional conventions can't operate in an intellectual vacuum, or they can and they do stupid things. So there is a big role for this conversation. Not from, I'm giving you the outside. I'm an outsider who actually happens to know a good deal about Brazil. But it's for you who know a great deal about Brazil and know something about the outside, so that you can look around and get good ideas. That's for you the next 2 or 3 years, not 10. Because if Bolsonaro loses, there'll be a moment of opportunity. And you may take it, you may not. But I very much hope you do, because I'll be using you as an example for the United States if you do. And if you don't, I'll just ignore it.
So speaking of moments of opportunity, I'm going to extend our time for 5 minutes to give Ana one opportunity for one last round of question, and then we conclude.
Professor, I would just bring it back to the beginning of our discussion. In a sense, we talked a lot about impeachment, and I think we actually are discussing also presidentialism and parliamentarism as we were discussing impeachment. And bringing that back to the idea in your book, I keep wondering, and this is a question that I would just throw to you, and I'm sure there are many ways in which you can answer. What is the relationship? Because it seems to me that there's an implied relationship in the different case that is in your book between this fundamental choice to keep the presidential system and the revolutionary tradition. And I wonder if you could maybe tell us a little bit about that when you have Brazil in mind.
Right. Well, you see, as I suggested, Brazil did not make a fundamental choice for presidentialism in 1987 and 88. It made a fundamental choice for parliamentarianism. And they expected in the 5-year referendum for there to be a ringing endorsement of the original proposal. It was then that the accidents of history, which are always very important, intervened, so that Lula doesn't make it into the final round. Collor comes out of nowhere. Collor is corrupt. Collor, because he doesn't have any real political support, gets kicked out. And then, how many weeks later? 5 weeks, 6, how much? 6 months later? I don't forget how many months later. You have a referendum in which vindicates, the presidential system's triumph. It's that scenario which is still governing your collective imagination. In Diretas, and this, and then now with the present crisis. And my basic argument is to say, you had a successful parliamentary regime between 1891 and the stock market crash. Then you had a successful presidential regime. Then you had a successful transition to democracy. But between the successful transition of 1989 and the presidential regime, you had American imperialism. And it is a mistake for you to indulge in reverse American imperialism by copying the American system of impeachment, which was sensible 200 years ago, but it's not sensible today. And I'm trying and maybe succeeding in trying to, as much as possible, update it through congressional legislation. But Jamie Raskin, who is a genuine, serious intellectual in the House of Representatives, has drafted really outstanding legislation which would do a great deal. But unfortunately, attention has been diverted to the Ukraine, and I'm afraid, well, we'll see whether it gets actually enacted in time for the next election. My fundamental thought is you should look to beyond the United States as you consider the foundational issues of presidential responsibility to Congress and crisis versus principles, and that the Electoral Commission should be reorganized, and the rules should be clearer, but these crises of the foundations of the Republic that are perceived by everyone are fundamentally different from long-term Supreme Court principles, and that the two institutions, the Supreme Court and the revised electoral body, should be constituted in dramatically different ways. Okay, that's I think good enough.
So thank you very much, Professor Ackerman, and thank you to Professors Ana Beatriz, Robalinho, and Tomás Pereira as well for a great discussion. So we're going to end here, almost at the right predicted time for the ending. Thank you, Professor
I
Ackerman,
should say, I'd be happy to continue the conversation. All that you have to do is to email me at bruce.ackerman@yale.edu. And of course, sometimes it will take me a few weeks, but I have a file and I am very interested in Brazil.
Thank you.